Hello everybody, and welcome to our second part where we discuss the social, economic and political effects of the war. We have a lot to cover, so we're going to try and do some German efficiency, like they have in Chloe's favourite thing, a German factory.
Factory.
Yeah. So
just a quick word. It's episode 10. That means we've had as many episodes as there were plagues.
As plagues.
The 10 plagues, in fact.
Oh wow. We've had as many. No, we must focus. So, initial reactions to the war, political particularly. The Bergfriede. Now, tell me about the Bergfriede.
Well, basically, it was that everyone came together.
Political truce.
Political truce is what it means, literally. But what it meant was all the parties in the Bergfriede, including, crucially, the SPD, who had been very anti-government, not anti, but opposed to the government, at least. And they said, they took in the government's portrayal that it was a defensive war, it wasn't Germany's fault, and they showed loyalty in a time of crisis. And that was crucial. Military censorship, official propaganda was introduced, and that kept the people on side until at least 1916. So there was a lot of unity in Germany behind the war effort.
So we move on to Germany's economic limitations.
We spoke as this as one of the reasons why Germany lost the war.
Their export industries were badly disrupted. Its capacity to feed its own people was limited, and its ability to import raw materials was severely curtailed, particularly due to blockades and the like. Oil, rubber, nitrates, copper, etc. were very, very hard. So
what did they try and do to combat this, Remy?
It wouldn't have been the KRA by any chance.
I think it would have been.
The War Raw Materials Department within the War Ministry
set
was
up
set up.
Rathenau Siam.
Oh yeah, Walter Rathenau himself, who was later assassinated.
He was indeed.
I hadn't made a connection. So it kind of saw, basically, it oversaw companies whose job it was to acquire and distribute the most vital of these raw materials.
It's almost a nationalisation, but not quite.
Not quite. Labour, the War Ministry decided who should be conscripted. Women, hello Chloe, were not conscripted.
You can represent all women.
But by the end of the war, they made up a third of the workforce. Local war boards were set up to kind of representatives from Labour, and in the short term, there was an attempt to regulate a war economy, which was quite successful, but towards the middle parts of the war was less successful. So,
third aspect we're looking at in Germany's economic limitations was finance. Pre-war, Germany had a massive debt. We spoke about that in earlier episodes. And the sale of war bonds was used to try and finance the war. Not a great idea, to be honest, because by the end of the war, only 16% of war costs were met through taxation. The rest was through war bonds, printing money, which, as many of you will know, will result to a bit of inflation. And the reduced value of the mark.
A lot.
And that's going to cause massive problems in Weimar, Germany.
My Lieblingsrepublik.
So, Chloe, tell us about food.
Yeah, I mean, the blockade and the conscription meant that Germany basically just couldn't feed itself. Most of the able-bodied men were off fighting, so when the women weren't working the land, there was just basically not enough food to go around, and they couldn't import it because of the blockades either. The government did try and combat this by attempting to gain control over the agriculture of the country, but this wasn't very popular amongst the Parafiyonkers, which were farmers and kind of wealthy landowners. So they tried to combat this with the War Nutrition Office to regulate food supplies, but the massive resistance from the agriculture lobby meant that this wasn't adequate either.
A black market developed in food. Bring on to the 1916 December Auxiliary Service Law. The Supreme Military Command was determined to set...
Who were like Hindenburg and London.
Yeah, they were determined to set the clearly defined targets that would intensify the war effort, and the law was aimed to achieve the mobilisation of the entire civilian population for war service, which some historians, argue is the creation of a total war.
But perhaps Germany didn't have total war in the same way the British government did. Britain did. Industries, they weren't nationalised exactly. They were told that they should work towards war effort, but they weren't nationalised. Landowners remained independent. They had their own property rights, and they weren't mobilised. The whole economy wasn't mobilised in the same way, which meant that maybe was one of the reasons why Germany didn't win the war.
Yeah, and in general, the policies were pretty disastrous for the stability of the Kaiserreich, which is amazingly, that was such poor Kaiserreich, which amazingly we haven't actually mentioned in our podcast yet.
Yeah, that word has knocked up. So I'm going to say it lots of times.
Kaiserreich. Okay.
But moving on swiftly to political change. In 1916, we saw, we mentioned in the last episode that Ludendorff and Hindenburg take over, and many people describe that as a silent dictatorship. The power of Bethmann Hollweg was massively declining. The Kaiser was, I don't know what the Kaiser was doing, basically nothing is the answer. So we see that basically Ludendorff and Hindenburg were in control. They were virtually a military dictatorship, and if Kaiser Wilhelm or Bethmann tried to stop them doing what they wanted to, they were threatened to resign. And as they were very popular and the only ones with really any backing from the Reichstag or from the people, they were threatened to resign, and Wilhelm or Bethmann would retreat and they would continue. So we basically have a silent dictatorship from the summer of 1916.
So we move on to the. If there's anything else.
Oh, sorry, I may have skipped over a few things. I don't think so.
Not particularly. Yeah, Hindenburg became the joint leader of the Supreme Military Command. With Ludendorff, which I just think is important to emphasise. So we move on. Kaiserreich. we move on to the human experience. We clearly are all humans. Imagine
so were the Germans. It's hard to believe.
That sort of attitude just fuels social.
Hatred,
social Darwinism.
I'm just lighting the fire of hatred.
So, human experience, military morale.
Big issue.
Was actually rather poor. It was incredibly 1.8 million Germans died in the war. Millions more had disabilities. Even more starved. I had very little food, etc. And this really helped, particularly amongst the poor, helped to gain popularity for left-wing ideas and left-wing ideology.
However, other men found the sort of discipline and camaraderie of being in the trenches and fighting with your friends very fulfilling. Men like Hitler, for example.
Yeah, Hitler. What can we say about Hitler?
I don't know, Remy.
I think he was a bit of a dictator.
Anyway,
that was Mr. Bradley's humour right there.
And despite the fact that they resented their well-off officers, there was no large-scale breakdown of order. There was no huge mutinies that we may have saw in Russia, for example. So the military morale stayed high enough to sustain the war effort. Only when the war was lost did we really see unrest amongst the military.
So, as we said, there were vast food and fuel shortages, loads of civilian deaths, mortality, flu epidemic, inflation. All of these, in the last 2 years, at least saw an increase in social discontent. And people particularly were angry at the sharks of industry making huge profits. The military-industrial complex, you could argue.
And evil corporations.
Such a Dick Cheney. War aims.
This is a big issue from about 1916 onwards. We spoke about the military truce, the Bergfriede. We spoke about Bergfriede, but then in 1916 we see a bit of a split between the political parties. People like the SPD believe it should be a defensive war, that Germany should get peace as quickly as possible based on a compromise with no territorial gains.
Others believed in Siegfriede, I think that's pronounced, which is a victory peace, such as the Pan-German League, and they
nationalists.
Yeah, they were nationalists, and they wanted to expand Germany and expand...
Make it great again.
Yeah, basically. And it actually has quite a lot of support from all parties except the SPD and amongst the middle and upper classes. And yeah, that was it really.
So moving on
to we're doing okay for time. This will be a 15-minute episode. Moving on to the July 1917 crisis. This was a particularly big problem for Bethmann, who wanted to have a united political front in the Reichstag. And
wanted to avoid any kind of divisions between the left and the right and between the SPD and the Conservatives, but he basically failed. Isn't that not correct?
Yeah, his position was undermined by the Supreme Command, and this is where it gets a bit confusing. So there was the Kreuznach program,
which was a kind of program of like the military should expand and Germany should gain territory, basically Siegfriede. So he felt forced to promote Siegfriede because that's what the Supreme Command wanted, and as we mentioned, the Supreme Command were basically in control.
And this reduced Bethmann's standing with the left-wing politicians. And
this is the big moment for the ZP coming up.
Yep, their leader,
Diaz Erzberger.
Erzberger, he formed a coalition in the Reichstag which set out a motion of peace without territorial gains, which passed with 212 to 126 votes, which forced Beth Manholver to resign.
Because he lost the vote in the Reichstag, basically.
Which is interesting because he didn't have to constitutionally, but
No.
in this, he was really his power was undermined greatly.
This is where things get even more confusing.
Yep, because there was a polarization of the parties and of the left and the right. With the right wanting the Siegfried and Kreuznach, and they wanted expansion. There was, for example, Hindenburg and Ludendorff created the Fatherland Party, the conservative right-wing party, which backed the military's views, and had over 1.2 million members by 1918. However, on the left, what did the left want, Natal?
Well, thanks for asking. The left wanted compromise peace. They didn't want to force annexation on anyone, and they wanted constitutional reform. Similar to, they were kind of inspired a bit by the revolution which was going on in Russia in 1917. And you see the formation of the USPD, which is a more extreme version of the SPD. There's also the Spartacus League, who are
Far left.
far left, like Bolshevik styles. And there's an increase in the number of strikes, more demonstrations, more revolutionaries in the factories. So the right's becoming more right-wing and the left becoming more left-wing.
Just a fun fact, 40,000 days lost to striking in working days in 1915, and 33 million were lost in 1919.
That's a lot of days.
It is a lot.
That's like a few 100,000 years.
It is.
At a guess.
Yeah. So brings us to the defeat in 1913. 1918, of course. 1918. So by the middle of the year, the Kaiserreich was in trouble. Large socialist contended strikes. For example, in Berlin, over 500,000 workers struck for 5 days. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk initially seemed
like a victory for the right wing.
Yeah, for the right wing,
wing.
who supported Siegfried.
See, we get tired after about 12 minutes of podcasting.
Yeah,
but hopefully we can get through to the end.
You can do it.
There was a Ludendorff offensive which was launched but eventually failed on the 8th of August, the Black Day.
We mentioned that in the last episode.
Which we mentioned. Ultimately, a victory could have helped diffuse this political and growing social crisis. However, they lost. This is when I predict David is going to go, "Yeah, Britain!" But that could just be me. So yeah, Germany lost, and the Kaiserreich was brought to its knees by the economic crisis.
We're going to leave the constitutional crisis of the autumn of 1918 for the next
What
episode.
is going to happen?
We're going to tantalize. I don't know. I doubt you know.
I personally think Obama's going to become president, and
think
everything will be perfect again.
I think Gandhi is going to lead Germany.
Jinnah, okay.
Jinnah and Gandhi together will lead a revolution. Children of Lenin is returning to Germany, people. I'm just kidding. He was in Germany, I believe. Is that correct, Remy?
He was at one point. But not at this point. And that brings us to, at 13 and a half minutes, now, that brings us to the end of this podcast.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
I hope you enjoyed the first episode in double figures.
Brilliant.